So, it's called Judaism in context. Well, what does that mean? It means in context to everything else that people believe in and think about. It's how it fits into philosophy, psychology, parapsychology, other religions. It's just, I'm going to be talking mostly from the point of view of being Jewish. But I'm delving into all the other themes that you all belong to. So, these are the lectures we're having. Today, we're starting with one is when religion is negative. You don't mind that, Philip? No. So, I'm starting with that because when I tell people what we're going to do, the first thing I hear from most of the people is, what do you want to do that for, religion? Oh, who wants to hear about religion? You know, this is all the crime and the sorrow in the world, that's all religion, you know. That's why I'd like to talk about when religion is negative. And then next Sunday, I go back to the eternal triad. The eternal triad is goes all the way back to the axial days of Zoroastrianism and other Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and Judaism, Christianity, and all the rest. But it's the idea of the Trinity. That's what the triad is. The triad is this triangle. You see it here? You know what that is. Now what we do, we flip it upside down to remember that maybe what we're thinking was all wrong. No, I'm serious, that was all wrong. But if we flip it upside down and we join all the points, we get the oneness, right? We get the echad in Hebrew, oneness. So, but we'll talk about that later, next week. The myth dream is an analysis of charismatic characters throughout history. It's about millennialism. It's about everyone from messiahs and would-be messiahs, and I have a whole litany of this. And what causes a myth to become a practice of people? You have to have charismatic characters that will reflect the fears of other people, so it makes the other people feel this man understands them. You know, it's a whole, I go through the North American Indians, I go through Asian people and other things. My whole aim is really to show that the religious impulses, the impulse to have a feeling of awe and of safety and salvation is common to everybody, to all religions. And I just would like to show that. Then the last one for this month is I talk about Jewish culture mainly and explain what you're looking at in this room and why we do it and why we wear a hat, right? Now I notice you are too. We're wearing a white one, aren't we? That's for Catholics, right? But this is to remind us, for example, that whatever I'm saying, there's always something above me. Don't take myself too seriously. You know, whenever I study, I'm studying it from my point of view, but there's other points of view. And that's to remind me not to take it too seriously, you know, to look further. And then from there I go on and we go backwards in time to the axial age and the winter solstice and the development of why is the 25th Christmas? You know, it's common to some others too. You know, why is it that people have these religions that are telling people that this is the darkest time of the year, but light is on the way with the resurrection. At Easter, we have Passover, things like that. So we talk about the axial age is actually Zoroastrianism and other forms which come from ancient Persia and even from Japan and China. Then I have a session on Judaism and Christianity, and Judaism and Islam. And what's in a name? What's in a name? For example, I use the word for God here, G-O-D, because we have a mixed group, and you know what I'm talking about. But usually, and you'll see it in certain circumstances, if I'm referring to God, I write G-D. And that's a Jewish habit, because we have about 40, we don't know the definition of it. We have it, this is what religion's all about, the reaching out and trying to bring in these ideas into us. But we don't have a name for God. We have 40 words that are simply attributes of what we're thinking about. Right? And I'll explain that when we come to it, what's in a name. Then I go through liturgy, literature and liturgy. And from east to west, I'm going from the Far East to the Mid-East. And then we go to the West, we go into Freud, and we go to Kant, and we go to Nietzsche, and, you know, all this business to get into from east to west. Now, these others might be for Jewish people who'd like to learn about Judaism, okay? So that's just, I'm not being snide. We have things in our prayer book called the Shema Amidah, and Elena, it's good to delve into them and understand what they mean. Of course, it's open to everybody. I talk about prayer and faith. And the spiritual Big Bang. You know the Big Bang Theory, and you know the TV thing. But what do you think my spiritual Big Bang talk would be about? It would be about Sinai and the giving of the moral code, right? I just like that title. And then, of course, I have a Jewish timeline, Shabbat services, the Torah, Trop. The Trop are the musical notes in the 5 books of Moses. Everything is sung, and there's musical notes for them. And Philip knows them down there. Yeah, see Philip. And then I do a section because a minister from Rosse told me he had to do something on this was a few years ago. He had to do something for his group that when they meet every now and then. And he wanted my take on the wisdom of Solomon. So I gave him something, and I have it analyzed here. And then, of course, the Holocaust, and then renewal. So let me go back to today. I love the clicker. And I'll open this. I have to click on it. I want to start with you, with your brain, okay? So when I'm talking about this, I'm getting personal. And by the way, I see some chess players here. Right. What did Emanuel Lasker say when he wrote, when you see a good move, what do you do then?
To look around for a better one, but
That's
that's really
Lasker.
Damiano's saying.
And Damiano too, yeah. See, so that's what we're doing. We all have good views of what we believe in, but it doesn't hurt to look around, right? Look for a better move. You might go back to your own move, but it's good to look. So our brain, and I don't see Joe Arditi here, is he? No, okay, because he's a neurosurgeon in our congregation, and I'm talking about the brain, you see. So the brain has two sides. It has the left side and the right side. And I had other slides going deeper to show different parts, but it's not necessary. The left side of the brain now, people say that's the certain characteristics of your thoughts are on that side, and the other side are things like vision and stuff. But I want to analyze the two to show what's come up with modern thinking. So on the left side, that's where we have logic in your brain. Think of yourself. Logic, what you say, verbal things, details, science, evolution, names, math, strategy, order, thinking, and writing. It's really what we say like knowledge activity. Whereas on the right side, think of pictures and stories, big pictures, devolution, observation, shapes, music, patterns, imagination, beauty, possibilities. That's the spiritual side. Okay, you have knowledge and you have spirit, like that. The two sides. Luckily, there's a midbrain between the two, right? Otherwise, you know, we're, by nature, we're schizophrenic. But there is a midbrain, and dendrites going from one to the other. I'm going to start with one of the most favorite lines we have in Judaism, and it's one that all the children know and everyone else knows. And how does it operate with, I have two brains here. So if we read it in our prayer book, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So hear, O Israel, I'm looking at it in English, and it's going from left to right, isn't it? When you write, from left to right, from the left side of the brain. So when we read it, we think we understand it, and it's hitting it's coming from the left side of our brain, but hopefully it stimulates the other side through the midbrain. So it's looking for something more than what you can decide by science and other things. It's trying to stimulate. That's the normal part. But if we look at the Hebrew, and when you write that, I should have had it come in the proper way, but it's written from the right brain to the left brain. You see, from the left to the right. And other religions have that too, from the right to the left. So I'd like to just analyze, like the first word, Shema. This is a translation of the English, but rather the English is a bad translation of the Hebrew. Okay? Shema does not mean hear. A lot of people think it just means hear, but it also means listen. There's a difference. You can hear the train, or you can listen for it. One is active and the other is reactive. Is that okay? You know what I mean? Okay. So Shema could be listen. Now we come to Yisrael, Israel. Yisrael. Well, El, the last two letters you see, El, that's one of the words I was talking about for God. But it's the ancient Babylonian God that Jews use it and write, because they need something to write on, to write. I'm Elman, you know, but El, in Arabic you have Al-Akbar, God is great, right? El-Akbar. So it's a very ancient Babylonian word for one of their gods. And it was picked up by other groups simply because they have to speak about something and they give it that term. Now Yisra, for Israel, Yisra, that comes out of Genesis. And you know the story of Jacob. All right, Jacob did a dirty job on his brother Esau, didn't he? He stole his birthright, right? And after many years, Esau, who has now got a tribe of his own, is starting to come to his father Isaac's funeral. And Jacob is frightened. He's very frightened. What's going to happen to him when his brother comes back and confronts him, right? So the story goes, and all the stories, everything written in Genesis, you have to look very deep to get the real meaning. So the story goes that Jacob is out in the desert somewhere, and he's trying to get ready for his brother and his tribe coming back, and he's feeling regret for what he did. He feels miserable and frightened at the same time. So the story says that he fell asleep, and the story goes that he was fighting with an angel, and the point being that he was struggling within himself. Okay? So listen, you who are struggling with God. You ever see Fiddler on the Roof? Remember Tevye fighting with God? Right, that was a great thing. So this is fighting, struggling within yourself to understand things. That's what Shema Yisrael. Shema means listen, you who are struggling to understand. Okay with that? And then, the struggling, the Yisra is similar to jihad in Islam. It's the struggle of the soul, the struggling to understand things. And I'm coming to politics, but not right now. So, but it's interesting that the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, means the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And when I say one, it doesn't mean the only one. It means oneness. Everything oneness that we can't, that's what we don't understand, but we feel. Okay? The oneness. And you notice the writing goes from the right side of the brain to the left. And this from the spiritual side to the left. And hopefully it will stimulate our knowledge to start thinking about things. It's a nice way of looking at it, and maybe it's something new for some of you to understand, but that's Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu. Now the Adonai, see those two little backwards commas up there after Yisrael? There are two little letters. If I were to pronounce it, it would say ya. It's just an abbreviation of what we're trying to say. So we give it a word like Adonai, which is not a holy word. It means Lord or Master, but it's not sanctified. We say it to remind us we don't know. Why do we say it when it's not written that way? To remind us like this, we don't know what we're talking about. Right? And Adonai Echad, the Lord, Echad is one, the oneness, the circle. Listen, you who are trying to understand. So let's talk more about the left and right brain, science and religion. The left brain, science is all about explanation, and the right brain is about meaning. We're meaning-seeking animals. That's Rabbi Sachs. He comes up with that term a lot, the meaning-seeking animal. Science analyzes things and religion integrates. We need both sides. That's our brain. Science breaks things down to their component parts, and religion binds people together in relationships of trust. Science tells us what is. Religion tells us what ought to be. Science describes. Religion beckons, summons, and calls. Science sees objects. Religion speaks to us as subjects rather than objects. Science practices detachment, and religion is the art of attachment. Science sees the underlying order of the physical world, and religion hears the music beneath the noise. In other words, religion is spiritual. The other side of the brain is very busy and noisy all the time. The other side of the brain hears music beneath all that noise, the art. Science is the conquest of ignorance. Religion is the redemption of silence, which I like that term, redemption. Here's the noise on the left side, redemption of silence. You're getting into Hinduism and Zen Buddhism and other religions trying to have yielding for your inner self to take whatever comes without anything you thought of before. And there's silence at the top. It's called, in Zen Buddhism, they call it Satori, or religion. Not religion, it's the very top. Anyway, let's go to see what's wrong with religion. We just analyzed all your brains, okay, and how they work. So in the name of religion, and this is all about what's wrong with religion, but in the name of religion, we've had the Crusades, we've had the jihads, inquisitions, auto de fe. I don't have to explain these, I don't think. And pogroms that my grandparents ran away from in Russia.
I don't know auto de fe.
Huh?
I don't know auto de fe.
Auto de fe was burning people was one of the, it came out of the Inquisition and everything. And of course, ISIS is an example. In the name, all these in the name of religion. People have shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. To them, they had high ideals. And they were able to shed blood of people in the name of religion. People have hated in the name of the God of love. And people have practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion. And people have waged war in the name of the God of peace. And people have killed in the name of the God of life. All in the name of religion. So that led to people to become cynical about religion. And you hear a lot of cynicism today because of what's happening with religious groups. Pascal, for example, he said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. That's a very cynical, but that was his observation. Then we had Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another. Very cynical. And C.S. Lewis, I think we must fully face the fact that when religion does not make a man very much better, it makes him very much worse. Cynical ideas from how they see the world and how it acts. So let's see what the cynicism is all about. We try to understand them. Like you know this from Voltaire, the cynic is one who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. You're probably familiar with that saying. They know what things cost, say financially, but what's its value? The cynic's observation is not because religion is religion, but because human beings are human beings. Not angels, and certainly we're not gods. Religion has power. It bonds people as a group. It moves people to act, right? And it changes lives. But whatever has power can be used, misused, and abused. Anything that has power, there's the pitfall. Religion is like fire. It warms, but it also burns. So guess what? We're the guardians of that flame. That's it, right? The high ideals of a secular society. So we want to look at just a secular society now. We've had 100 years of bad people doing things in the belief that they're doing what is right from their point of view. You can name them off. The last 100 years we've had Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Eichmann, Mussolini, Mao, Pol Pot in Cambodia, right? Idi Amin, Robert Mugabe, Radovan Karadzic, not too long ago, and Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the beginning of ISIS, right? So, but each one of those, a lot of them thought they were doing the right for the people. I mean, right, from their point of view. High ideals of a secular society can be dangerous.
What about Sam Harris?
Hmm?
Sam Harris?
Saddam Hussein?
No, Sam Harris.
Sam Addis.
Okay, never mind.
No,
We can talk about it later.
yeah. Someone worse than that?
Very famous guy.
In the last 100 years?
He's only about 40 years now.
And what's he through?
He's a philosopher.
A philosopher. Well, that's right. That means I love wisdom. Philosophia. I'll put up with that. Now, the high ideals. Okay, I've just gone through them. Let's go back here. Science and technology. Okay, how is it used? Well, we come up with social, this is not religious group, but science and technology, the left side of the brain. Social Darwinism, the scientific study of race. And some of us are familiar with Cyclone B. That was the gas in the extermination camps. Marxist economic ideology was fine, but when it went to work and taken over by politics, it didn't work out too well. The gulag, social engineering, lobotomies, brain surgery like to pacify criminals, eugenics, all these have been put to use. Forced sterilization, euthanasia, modern methods of torture, mind control. Okay? It's just put that in to show these are things that happen, right? And with people, like some people hate, envy, seek power over others, want revenge for real or imagined humiliation. So when you see those on the left, there's the capacity to rationalize and justify what we call as evil. And we can rationalize religious hatred when we think along these terms. Ethnic hatred, ideological hatred. Those hatreds demonize the other, making people feel threatened and thus defensive aggressive. You know what I mean by that? If you're threatening people, those people are going to threaten you back because that's their defense. Threatening people put them in the same boat in order to, they feel they need defensive, but it's an aggressive thing. The problem is not science nor religion, but the problem is within ourselves. Jeremiah said, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond pure. Okay, beyond pure. Now, I just want to go through 5 different hazards to be avoided. And I use the term there, I believe what I know. No. And I also later on talk about I know what I believe. Through little differences. We'll look at each one. But the 5 hazards, I've listed them here. It doesn't mean that these things are bad, but they're difficult to understand in just literally reading them. We have difficult text, dualism, messianic politics, the pursuit of power, and single vision. I'm going to go through the 3. We'll start with difficult texts. Now, whether you're secular or religious, we've got to ask why the ideals in which we believe can in certain circumstances do harm. Okay. The sanctity of religion should never be used as a shield against honest self-criticism. We sometimes feel other than what we've accepted, but we're afraid to face up to it. The sanctity of religion should never be used as a shield. In other words, sanctity should not stop us from having honest self-criticism. There's more than one perspective on reality. And that's more or less the theme that we're talking about. It's like we were talking about the chess moves. There's more than one way of looking at things, and you may go back to your original way, but at least you're inquisitive. Difficult text. Now let's look at some of them. There are scriptural passages with which if taken literally and applied directly would lead to results at odds with that religion's deepest moral convictions. Scriptural texts I'm talking about now. You know, we're told these are, that we read them and we don't think twice about them, but if we take them literally the way they're written, right, we start feeling, geez, that's not right. Let's take, for example, the Akkad in Genesis. That awful story of Abraham, and he's given a command to kill his son, Isaac. Right, there's a good example. The sages have given all kinds of examples and reasons why it's still in the book. But they don't mess with the book the way it's written, but they try to interpret. I came up with my own interpretation, but whatever interpretation you come up with that story is valid. That comes out of your own conscious mind. It's valid. Mine is that you don't sacrifice your children for your ideas. It's neat, sort of satisfying, but it's only one interpretation of that story. There are passages in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran that, taken in isolation, are radically inconsistent with the larger commitments of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to the sanctity of life and the dignity of all persons as bearers of God's image. Difficult passages in our sacred books demand interpretation in order to get deeper and more fulfilled. Such passages require interpretation. I notice the screen is copying what I just said. So here are some Genesis that I have in Hebrew. There's Bereshit, Genesis. Difficult text. I'm not going to explain these, but you'll know they're difficult. God threatens and backs down. This is all in Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. Cain murders and he walks away from it. God overreacts and then floods the world. Abraham defends the guilty and loses. Lot's daughters rape their father and saves the world. Talion, that's from Hammurabi and the Torah. The Hammurabi goes back to Zoroastrianism and predates Judaism. But that's the, an eye for an eye, the Talion. Yeah. Abraham commits attempted murder and is praised. Jacob deceives and gets deceived. Dinah is raped and her brothers take revenge. Tamar becomes a prostitute and she's the progenitor of King David and the Messiah. Joseph is framed and then frames his brothers. And here I have a cherub. It's pre-Judaic, but I put that in because if you notice, we don't have any, we have one picture of Herzl Koszewski's painting of our old synagogue. And we have these done by Mrs. Kalp, who, these are the windows of the Hadassah Hospital in Israel. And they're done, and the windows were done by Chagall. You've heard of the artist Chagall. So these are the 12 tribes of Israel, you see. And someone did mention to me we should have had one more, because this is very, it doesn't include Dinah, the daughter. This day and age, they need another one. Difficult texts. Joseph is framed and then frames his brothers. And the cherub, yeah. The reason I mentioned the cherub is that pre-Judaism, they had a lot of imagery for their sacred things, the pictures. And Rome also had many years later, too, images. We don't stress images that much because they're too defining, unless it's really good art. But in here, the image that we rely on is the image that comes out of our feelings and our mind from a source that we sort of believe is going to fill us, with some inspiration. Okay. Okay, so difficult texts. Now, what I'm going to show you now is what's going on next week, if you're back. In Rabbinic Judaism, we have the oral law, which is our traditions and our interpretation of things. And the rabbi said, this is after the destruction of the temple. There were rabbis before a few, but they became more important to us in the Middle Ages because we had no temple. They were like sages. The word rabbi simply means teacher. Okay. So the oral law, meaning what they come up with their interpretation in the 1600s, 1700s, it's equal in authority to the written scrolls. So we have the Old Testament, right? The written scrolls. But Rabbinic Judaism says, keep thinking, keep talking, give us thoughts, you know, it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. You have the Torah, and you have the Talmud, of Rabbinic Talmud in the Middle Ages or even before, and it's ongoing. It never stops. Collections. You know, when the Jews left Israel, they were kicked out, and for 2,000 years they wandered in the different little villages around Europe and Russia and whatnot. And there was no temple. In Israel, and the Israelites, when they had Israel, at least they had a temple in Jerusalem, but even people up north or down south, to go to a service, they had to travel with their horses or buggy, whatever. They had to go to a temple maybe 3 times a year for a special holiday. But now, without a temple, you could go anywhere. We talk about it a little later. Christianity. From Corinthians, we read the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Right? The letter is really something written, the left side of your brain. The Spirit gives life, the right side of your brain. So with the Spirit, you think spiritually about something. You zap the midbrain and you can explain it to yourself from the left side of the brain. Islam. Here, Sharia represents divine law in the Quran, revelation, and the Sunnah, the normative practice of the community. All 3 of these monotheistic religions approach these things that I ideally the same, and I break those down later on. So like analytic and jurisprudential systems of interpretation, I'm not going fully into them, I just want to show you what we'll be talking about next week. In Judaism, we have these 4 intellectual paradigms that we can go through. We have the Peshat, Remetz, Drash, and Sod. So the Peshat is the storyline. All right, the storyline. The Remetz is you have a hint from the storyline, there might be something more to it. And that's discussed amongst students. The Drash, you've really got something from interpretation and a few things, like several moves that are good, right? That's the Drash. And a lot of writing in books and what come out of the Drash, going from one step to the other. The Sod is the mystical. You're leaving explanation behind. You're trying to express things in a mystical way. It's interesting, if you take the first 3 letters, these are Hebrew words. If you take the first 3 letters of each, the P, R, D, and S, that's a Hebrew word, pardes, which means a garden or an orchard where things grow. Whoever wrote those as an explanation had the Garden of Eden in mind. Medieval Christianity also similarly, a literal reading, an allegorical reading, moral and eschatological interpretations. You know, the end of times and redemption and resurrection, all that. All of these are the same, really. And Islam also have these. Is there anyone here Islamic? can help me with it. But these are the same things. The fig is like our Peshat HaRambam, and then they have these different levels, which next week I have them all broken down and explained, and you see the similarity. These are the scholarly approaches to their religions, and the three religions have scholars that are, and sometimes the scholasticism doesn't get down to the flock, I'll put it that way. You know, you have the minister, the priest, and the flock. Sometimes it's not the priest, but it's a scholar. Well, the priest can be a scholar too, to the flock. These are systems to relate the infinite word to the finite world, to spell out details unspecified in the text, and to resolve seeming inconsistencies between one passage and another. This is what we call food for thought. Interpretation is the lifeblood of all studies that rely on the holy text. I say holy because canonical sounds difficult to me. Let's take Adam and Eve for an example. Jews never thought there was an Adam and an Eve, even though that's in Genesis, right? Adam comes from a Hebrew word, Adamah. Adam is the Hebrew for Adam. And that comes from Adamah, which is the earth. Where's my friend? I'm looking for my dentist. Where is he? Huh? There he is. There he is. Am I right?
Yep.
Okay, I have an Israeli here. Living here in St. John. So Adam is like the earth, Adamah. The Hebrew word for Eve is Chava, which means love. In the beginning there was creation and there was the spirit. It was the two sides of the brain that we talked about. In the beginning there was nature and there was the spirit, Adam and Eve, right? Now that's a big hop from thinking there were two people. Okay? And you get much more out of it when you read it and you read the portions. Okay? The Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, that's, I put it in. So the Garden of Eden, all right, there were two trees, weren't there? There's a tree of knowledge, of good and evil, and the tree of life, the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And they were told, don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? But they just mentioned that, the yin-yang tree. Because then you're thinking of dichotomy. There's no unison, there's no sun, there's no mystical, and you get into trouble. Well, this is our natural way of living. We're not in blessed realms, ideally, unless we dream or we get good feelings now and then. But the Garden of Eden has two. They have the tree of yes and no, good and bad. And I have another slide to go into that. And then we have the tree of life. Life in Hebrew is Chai. Chai is also the number 18. Every letter, like Aleph, is 1. Beit is 2. Every letter is the number. So the number 18 gives you the word Chai, which is Hebrew for life. So if you're going to give a bar mitzvah boy a present, give him a check for $18. You know, things like that. The Tower of Babel. We all know the story of the Tower, surely the Tower of Babel. So the tribe, not tribes, but the people wanted to be in heaven. They wanted to be what they thought was the ultimate high. So they built all these towers going up to heaven, right? Well, God didn't think much of that. He says, I'll teach them a lesson. So he destroyed all their work. The people then all spoke different languages. So what's the story? What's our interpretation? Right? You can't assume you're going to reach heaven, right? but you should listen to each other and try to understand what the other is saying. Different languages, right? But that's the metaphor of the story. And I've already talked about Yisra and Jihad and the genesis of justice. And there was a book that I have at home called The Genesis of Justice, because in Genesis you see all these stories, and some of them are very difficult stories, but they all end up with a suggestion of what should be just and what is injustice. But some of the words, you'd have to tear them up. But the genesis of justice, it's not until Exodus that you get towards what is moral. It's a little bit different. There's justice. I mean, justice is also maybe an eye for an eye, which we don't like, right? But what is the moral side? That's in Exodus. And then I have, for my friend sitting at the back of the room, you can look up page 92 and 114 in the Siddur to see about these ideas, what they mean. Transliteration is very common. I pick up a book in English and I read it, and the Hebrew's on the other side, and I get confused. There's on the back we have curtains with Hebrew letters that say Pitfalls, Sharai Zedek. Looks like a tree. You'll see it later maybe. So Pitfalls, Sharai Zedek means lead me or take me to the gates of righteousness. Sharai Zedek's the name of our synagogue. To the gates of righteousness. If you look on the English side, Zedek is not righteousness, but victory. Take me to the gates of victory. Now, it loses everything in translation. So that happens a lot in English translations. And I talked about the brain flow from right to left, the midbrain. So, sacred text and fundamentalism. So what is fundamentalism? Well, how's it stacked from what we're talking about? Every religion has its own traditions of interpretation, okay? That's why fundamentalism is so profoundly untraditional. So profoundly untraditional. There's nothing traditional about a person talking in a fundamentalist way. This is the way it is, and forget everything else. This is the way it is. Every religion must gain against a literal reading of its difficult text. Don't rely just on the way, little. If it is not to betray the deeper purposes. Fundamentalists fail to understand that the meaning within sacred text is not self-evident, and that's the key expression I like. You read something and you think, well, this is what you read all the time, and you go to services, you read the book and all that, you read it, you think you understand it. But meaning is not always self-evident. The meanings try to get you inside to go deeper and deeper. Now we come to dualism. And next week it's all about this. So I'm not going to go into except one slide here. Dualism comes from, well, way back, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and all. And I can't put on the red light because it's a red screen. It doesn't show. But you all know the yin and yang, probably. You're familiar with that. So there's a supreme idea which we think we understand but not sure. But down below, we have good and bad, yes and no. We have, like I said before, we have, we have hearing and listening, action and reaction. We have the dualism of almost everything we can think of. And, but the thing is, the good and the bad, which is part of our judgment, See, without the supreme idea, I put a red line through it, without knowledge of the ultimate, we have to rely on human judgment. We want to tell the child not to put his hand on the hot stove, right? That would be bad, right? That would be bad, but on the other hand, I want to build a good house, so I cut down the trees. So is that bad? It is for the tree. But what I'm trying to point out is bad and good are relative things as a result of our human judgment. They're not ultimate judgments. And because they're our own invention, good, then we feel more comfortable if good is made absolute. And bad is absolute. It's no longer the yin and yang, which is relative. See the black dot in the white, that means it's not all white. Things aren't all dark. That's the relative side. But they fill up the circle, which represents the achud, the oneness. And of course that comes from the Far East. So when we make human judgments, we remove the relativity, don't we? You see, there's no dots in the diagram. An absolute God from our human point of view becomes G-O-D, and absolute bad is the devil. Now, I'm not saying there's no God. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is without the interpretation business, but we think we understand. But what we're understanding is something we've made absolute, but what we are drawn towards is the supreme idea. Everything else will flow from that, but it's like that's the supreme idea is like the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Everything else is, be careful, you're looking at good and evil and bad, good and bad. So this is, I think, interesting. Dualism is the attempt to forgive God. Why does a just God allow bad things to happen? It's a common problem, probably a lot of sermons based upon this, right? If we say that God allows things bad to happen and that there has to be a counterforce to that. So we have the devil, the demiurge, Satan, the Antichrist, the prince of darkness. We have the yes and the no, right? If we think one. So how do we forgive God? Well, we say God is in heaven and on earth evil reigns, is one way of thinking about it. But let's look at this. Dualism, the yes and the no, is the opposite of monotheism. Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Isaiah, for example, and this disturbs people, and it's a difficult text, but Isaiah writing, and when he says I, he's talking about God, okay? I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. That's a difficult text, isn't it, to accept? God creates disaster. You see, this is something that has to be interpreted, right? But that's what Isaiah writes. As humans, we're forced to wrestle with the ambiguities of our own character. We're forced to make moral choices. That's our responsibility. Our moral responsibility is to choose right from wrong, right? We have the responsibility to choose our own actions. If I do something wrong, it's not God's fault. It's my fault. So, but how does this go further? If it wasn't us and it wasn't God, so it must have been them that caused all the problem. Whoever them happened to be. All right. Penitential cultures become blame cultures, externalizing evil and projecting it on a scapegoat, thereby redefining the faithful as victims. If you're blaming other people who are happy amongst themselves and content, we create them as victims. We make them victims. Otherwise, we have to blame God for how they're acting, you know? So dualism can, not always, dualism can lead to demonizing the other, dehumanizing them, and of course that's what leads, and we see it today, to genocide. The others are no longer human. You know, it's nothing to cause havoc, and you're talking about it with Robert, you know, what's happening in Africa, so. So now we're going to look at messianic politics, and this is the politics of the end of days. Now the end of days comes long before Christianity, if we're familiar with that. But what happens with messianic politics? And the third lecture we have coming up is called The Myth Dream. I have a long list of messiahs throughout history and how they evolved and what happened to them in history. And an awful lot of them were Jewish. Have you ever hear of, well, I'll speak to you later. Abrahamic monotheism lives in the cognitive distance. It's their realization right now between the world that is and the world that ought to be. And Abrahamic monotheism says that this gap is breached by small daily altruistic steps. In other words, a little good at a time, right? Trying to behave yourself, you know, little goods at a time. The long, slow journey across the wilderness to redemption. That brings to mind from slavery to, from slavery to Sinai, right, in the Exodus. And that's why they call it Exodus politics. Day by day, small happenings, good things. We have a term in Judaism called teshuvah. Teshuvah means if you've done something really wrong, you're not damned to hell, which we don't have a concept of hell. You're not damned. What you do is teshuvah. You turn around. You just turn around and you act properly. You do good. Is the way to adapt. That's the theory. Exodus politics. On the other hand, sometimes the gap seems so, you can't wait for goodness to happen. The gap seems so large that it leads believers to hope for and expect a sudden denouement, a miraculous transformation of history. And this is the logic of the apocalypse or messianic politics that appears late in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Daniel and in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. But it's a psychological explanation as to the need of people to look forward to a miraculous something taking place in history rather than the small, painful steps. I quote Norman Cohn as one of my favorite writers. I'll just read it for you. Charismatic leaders offer their followers not just a chance to improve their lot and escape from pressing anxieties. It was also the prospect of carrying out a divinely ordained mission of stupendous, unique importance. This fantasy performed, and he spelled it PH, this fantasy performed a real function for them, both as an escape from their isolated and automatized condition and an emotional compensation for their abject status. So it quickly came to enthrall them in their turn. Charismatic leaders offer this. And In the Mithraeum, we go through all kinds of charismatic leaders, so we analyze what gives rise. There's two ways. We can have a Messiah, we can have a prophet, and their role is different and psychologically different. So a new group emerges, a restlessly dynamic and utterly ruthless group sometimes, which obsessed by the apocalyptic fantasy and filled with the conviction of its own infallibility, set itself infinitely above the rest of humanity and recognized no claim save that of its supposed mission. We see that happening today, right? The great mass of the disoriented, perplexed and frightened were and are drawn to this ideology. Now there's also the positive side of messianic dream. But I'm talking about what leads to chaos. So in a secular disguise, we had the French Revolution. Right? We had the Russian Revolution. We had the Caliphate recently revolution. Oh, it was a long time ago also. So this is a secular disguise of messianic, looking forward to a perfect world under different ideas. They want to reform society, overthrow the previous order, initiate a lasting utopia, use of terror to initiate the terror that precedes the last days, and the will to sin for the sake of the end. And the French, Russian, the Caliphate revolutions were horrendous, weren't they? But the idea wasn't in the beginning. Messianic politics lead to disaster because the attempt to bring the end of time within time, the attempt to bring redemption to the as yet unredeemed situation, the attempt to create utopia in real space and time, and Judaism's rejection of it. Well, if you look back, there was a rebellion against Rome. And it was disastrous. In 66 of the Common Era. By the way, we don't say AD and PC here, so you get used to that. CE means the Common Era, and that's used by other groups too, Common Era. And BCE is before the Common Era, all right? Instead of using the Latin, you know. So in 132 CE, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Now, Bar is Aramaic. Like Norman there, his Hebrew name is Ben Nachum, right? No, Nachum ben...
Fishel.
Huh?
Nachum ben Fishel.
Okay, Nachum ben, right? But it could have been Nachum Bar. Bar is also, and some of these plates in the back have Ben or Bar. Bar is actually the Aramaic, which was like Yiddish is today, the dialect of German. In those days, Aramaic was the language spoken everywhere. So, but Bar Kokhba was considered to be a Messiah, because the Messiah in Hebrew from Isaiah was thought to be another King David, who bring peace and judgment and everything to the world, you know, and reestablish whatever was lost by the people. It wasn't as mystical. But the Bar Kokhba, he was considered a Messiah, Mashiach in those days. What were the results of this? And you can see why Judaism rejected it. They destructed the second temple. There was no more priesthood, no more temple. The razing of Jerusalem, 580,000 deaths, and then exile for 2,000 years. All due to Bar Kokhba's messianic ideas. Thereafter, the efforts of the rabbis, because there were no more priests, there were rabbis, teachers, sages, were directed to depoliticizing Judaism and neutralizing the messianic idea. And we look at the pursuit of power, separation of church and state. That's separation, right? Politics and religion do not mix. They are different activities, and we looked at that originally. Religion aims at unity, and politics lives with diversity. Religion seeks salvation, politics seeks power. Religion refuses to compromise, but politics depends upon compromise. Religion aspires to the ideal, politics lives in the real, the less than ideal. Religion is about the truths that do not change. Politics is about the challenges that constantly change. When religion becomes political, or politics become religious, the result is disastrous to both. So let's look at paganism up here in the top left. We go back to the early days in Persia, Sumeria, way back. The head of the state and was also the head of the religion. He was considered a demigod, a child of God, the sole representative of a god. The ruler could be both king and priest. Paganism. Now, when I say paganism, I'm talking about something that's banned. I lived for a year up in the Arctic, and the Inuits had, of course they were influenced, once a year they had a missionary drop in on them, but they really had their own pagan beliefs. They had something of value. At that time there was a book out, I don't know if you're all too young, but something of value was about Kenya and how the occupation by the colonialists didn't replace their values with something of value. They wanted to teach them about the religion that was prominent in Europe, Then let's go over to the Hebrew monotheism. You notice there's a difference between Hebrew monotheism and I have down below Judaism. So the Hebrew monotheism is more the ancient, right? Power was secularized, all right, and had moral limits according to the authority of God. The people were entitled to rebel against kings. And that led both to the English and American revolutions, and now we're looking at a new American revolution to get rid of the same tyranny. Actually, that's just a little political. Prophets in the ancient Hebrew days, they kept the power of kings in check. That was a new thing, a new era. Early Christianity focused on kingdom of heaven, not of earth. And in the 4th century, the religious sect became an imperial power with Constantine, with the Holy Roman Empire. And, what happened then, it became history. Judaism, the Hasmonean monarchs, this is the time of where we celebrate Hanukkah. The Hasmonean monarchs combined kingship with the high priest. That was in the old temple before it was destroyed. But the priests were replaced after the temple was destroyed. It was replaced by rabbinic Judaism, which took a different turn. It didn't do away with the old writings. It kept moving forward right up to last night, or today. Okay. So the evolution of Judaism, it's a repeat. With the temple sacrifices, monarchy, and prophets gone, a faith matured which was centered around home, synagogue, and school that could be taken anywhere. Synagogue is Greek, in the Greek word. Symbiotic, syncretic, it's a gathering of people, something coming together. So you can go anywhere in the world. They have a synagogue. We don't call this, it is a synagogue, and here we are, gathered together. But it's more than just coming together. It's It's a Sharai Zedek, which is like the gates of righteousness, it's moral teaching. To us, the highest form of worship is study. That's the basic. The highest form of worship is study, and that's to get to the Sodar, the mystical, the supreme idea. Study. Not until the rise of racial anti-Semitism throughout Europe in the 19th century were Jews to organize themselves politically again. And that's what scares me about Israel today, my friend. We were talking about it earlier. Because now Israel's a country. It's got politics. It's got a government, right? It's lost its innocence for the past 2,000 years, which we think as being a terrible thing. But literature and grew during those terrible days of the exile. Now being back, we have all the problems of politics. Despite their dispersion, Jews and Judaism survived. So how? What's the secret? Everyone says, how come you survived all these massacres throughout history? And we're still here. You know, the Jews are only 0.025% of the world population. It's been steady almost like that. Even people were complaining about that number after the 6 million were lost. But it's boomed up again. But think how small we are. 0.025% of the world's population. How did we survive? Well, Jews made the fateful discovery that a religion can survive without power. Okay? That's just something to think about. I'm almost through. What time is it?
3:15.
Oh, I'm sorry. Good. Let's look at what happened with Christianity when it got political, very political through the Middle Ages and whatnot. We look at Martin Luther and the challenge to Rome. 30 Years' War changed the political landscape of Europe. 17th century, interesting because now there was new approaches to science, politics, and philosophy, industrialization. All these things were happening. The modern world was starting to bloom. And Christianity became the main source for disputes, saying, who needs all that stuff? We're building a new world, right? So the secularization of Europe, and yet it was still power. It wasn't just religion. There was politics. Protestants and Catholics were in constant conflict with each other and incapable to survive without holding on to their form or their traditions and what they had, the church. But religion and power writes history. Religion against power writes history. No religion relinquishes power voluntarily. The combination of religion and power leads to eternal factionalism, the splitting of the faith into multiple strands, movements, denominations, and sects, as we know. At some point, the adherents of a faith find themselves murdering their own fellow believers. It's only this that leads the wise to realize that this can't be the will of God. Now, democratic politics is a religious achievement because it secularizes power, right? It secularizes power. There's politics and there's the church. It's this separation of state and church. Democratic politics. And so, because truth cannot be proved by power. You can't force people to be saved. We went through the Inquisition, okay? Coerced agreement does not consent. That's from the Babylonian Talmud writings. If you try to force people to agree with you, it doesn't mean they're consenting to what you're saying. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. That's from Matthew. Right? And the Quran says there is no compulsion in religion. Now you think politically that's not what they're saying today. But the Quran says there's no compulsion. You don't have to. It's not a case of you must do this and you must do that. That's all right for those who don't go any deeper than what it says. They form their own religion. There's no compulsion in religion. Now, finally, we have single vision to think about. What are radical secularists? They're devout atheists, but they're devout. Okay. Devout atheists. And we have religious radicals who are from the far right. There are, right? So let's look at each very quickly. Bad things happen when science declares itself the last word on the human condition and engages in social or bioengineering, treating humans as objects rather than as subjects, and substituting cause and effect for reflection, will, and choice. Their hubris is that they know what they believe. Now, the word hubris, you probably all understand it. I prefer a different word than hubris because I like the word chutzpah. You know what? You've heard of chutzpah? Okay, their chutzpah is that they know what they believe. Radical secularism. Now let's look at religious radicals. Bad things happen when religion ceases to hold itself answerable to empirical reality, when it creates devastation and cruelty on earth for the sake of salvation in heaven. And their chutzpah is that they believe what they know. See, in other words, belief can be perilous. I'm not saying it always is, but it can hold you back. You've got to open up that belief and live it, understand it. So let's look, people do learn. For example, factionalism of the Jews, they're broken up into different factions of the Jews. Seeking power led to 2 defeats with Rome. So what do? They learn teshuvah. They learn instead to study prayer and acts of kindness, rather than trying to defeat Rome. The Puritans were religious zealots, but they were also they gave us the modern form of freedom and the liberty of conscience. People learn. On the other side, profoundly religious people took pride in the separation of church and state. They eventually took pride in the separation. See, they learned. Religious Christians led the fight against slavery. A religious Jew, Lewis Conference, I just threw this in, created the SPCA. And Islam in Andalusia and in India under Akbar the Great pioneered religious tolerance. Would you have believed it? That's true. Comes out of the books. This is the last slide we have to know. Then I'll wake you up. Religions work best when they're open and accountable to the world. Not just your own clique, to the world. When they develop into closed, totalizing systems and sectarian modes of community, when they place great weight on the afterlife or divine intervention into history, expecting the end of time in the midst of time, then they can become, not always, but they can become profoundly dangerous. For there is then nothing to check their descent into fantasy, paranoia, and violence. So the answer is not no religion, right? Which is impossible and undesirable since we are meaning-seeking animals. We're always looking for meaning. But the critical dialogue between religion and science, the necessary conversation between the twin hemispheres of our brain, that alone can save us from danger and despair, and to remind you that I'm talking about you. I'll bring this back. That's it. Okay? Thank you very much.